Step 5. So I hope you noticed the spelling. Obviously, practice with an S is the verb. So it's the action of practicing, whereas practice papers, obviously with a C, was the noun. There are lots and lots of practice papers online. I've included a couple of links, I believe, on this slide with some, as you can see here, a couple of little links at the bottom here. You can go onto the exam boards websites and they have some papers on their past papers that you can look at. I've purposely not given you anything by the exam board myself directly because there's copyright issues, but it's fine for students to go on to AQA or Edexcel and go and see what they can download. There will be last year's papers, but they should be securely tucked away because they're used for mocks. And obviously, in all of my masterclasses, I'm very careful what I share with people and what I refer to in terms of past papers, because you may well have done them or not. You may be someone who's about to sit those mocks, so I have to be very careful. But I've given you a couple there, and there's lots that you can try. Okay, so obviously, I could sort of talk about this forever, but I want to direct you again to one of the freebies that I've given you. And again, if you haven't downloaded this, please do. It's on freebie number 2, and this covers the writing section, part B. It's usually called part B, I think, in most of the exam boards. Section B, writing. And this is the transactional persuasive writing tasks, okay? Transactional just means it's got a particular focus to it in terms of the purpose. So the thing I really want to refer you to is TAP. I use TAP. You might see it on BBC Bite Size as GAP, genre, audience purpose. Type and genre are very similar. What type of document is it? This is important for you to know because certain types of documents follow certain rules and conventions. Depending on your age, and there's some adult learners here as well, you'll particularly know what a broadsheet and a tabloid are, and you'll know why broadsheets are called broadsheets. But those of you who don't, who are used to sort of reading online and clicking things, in the days after broadsheets, the different types of newspapers. Tabloid is very sensational, sort of the equivalent of clickbait, but in written form, if you like. And that's not to denigrate them, but if you think of things like The Sun is a tabloid, whereas a broadsheet's meant to be more for a more, I suppose, how would I describe it, discerning audience who wish to read more. The Times, Telegraph, those sort of papers. Broadsheets, it goes back to the days where they really were huge newspapers that you would end up almost encroaching into another person's space, particularly when they're read on the train. So they did shrink them, but at the time they were called broadsheets. So it depends on what type of document it is. A broadsheet's going to have a much more complicated lexis, more advanced vocabulary than a tabloid, which is why I'm pretty sure most of the examples, if not all, will always ask for a broadsheet newspaper and not a tabloid. If you're studying media studies, you may have more of an idea of what I'm talking about. If you don't, feel free to go and look up tabloid and broadsheet for newspapers. If you're asked to write a newspaper article, then it's good to know not just, what a broadsheet is and the conventions, but who needs to read those or who would read them. Letters universally agreed on as pretty straightforward, but know your formats, okay? Yours sincerely and yours faithfully. Sincerely is for if you know the name of the person, dear John Smith, whereas faithfully is dear sir, dear madam, and you don't know their name, okay? So there's certain conventions that you would follow with a letter. Diary is a first person emotive account usually. That's not an exhaustive list. Speech is not written up here, but it could well be a speech. So know the different types of document. Know your audience. Who are they for? Cultural references will make a big difference here, and how you speak to people. All right, but always err on the side of formality if you're not sure. And purpose. Main purposes you're going to have here are writing to advise, giving people a list of options and letting them choose. Entertain is pretty self-explanatory. It's kind of close to explain. Persuade and argue are very useful if you follow persuader, which is a mnemonic I've given you here. Look, every letter of persuader has a technique and an example. Useful. They're slightly different in that I would say politicians persuade, lawyers argue. So persuade tends to be more looking at the pros of something and why that's good, and only why that's good. So Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech is persuasive, whereas argue is pros and cons. It's arguments and counter arguments. So you're thinking not just why something's good, but why is the reason to go against it wrong, for example. So you'll get quite a few different examples of writing to argue. The best one I can think of is a newspaper article called Ban the Blazer, written by a parent against uniform. And it's very good. He gives a list of arguments for uniform and then basically proves them to be all wrong. So that's a good example of writing to argue. And yes, he uses persuader. So I've used in this, look, you could read through, obviously the format varies for all of the different exam boards. So I gave you the two main ones. These are two most common in terms of numbers. If you're not sitting these exam boards, my apologies. There are questions of this ilk for you, but you can just see from AQA and Edexcel how they're set out differently. Okay, so you need to be aware of that. However, in terms of content, they're quite similar. Steps for success, very straightforward. Read the question, identify tap, and if that means highlighting, do so. Be familiar with the requirements, the conventions. Okay, so if it's persuade, then you'd use persuader, but if it's advise, you probably wouldn't. Some teachers have taught different mnemonics, aphorist, aphorist, there's many more. Okay, if it works for you, use it, but I use persuader. Work through. Steps for success would mean you do a mind map. So you'd read the question, highlight tap, mind map it, and maybe put persuader next to it if applicable. Get your ideas down, and then as you can see from these numbers, they're all over the place, I sequence it last. So I'll get all my ideas down, maybe which persuader technique I'm going to use, and sequence it. I'm not saying this is the only way you can do it. It's just an idea. It helps you to get everything in. So yeah, I said sequence, start writing, step 7, proofread it. You must sit and read it. This is why I personally like it for AQA students. And yes, Edexcel, I would probably say is a good idea to try. See if you can do the writing section first, because you can write it, proofread it, do your reading. And then if you've got time, you can always proofread it again. Most boards, these sections of the questions, the writing sections worth a lot of marks. So it's worth, it's quarter of the whole GCSE. So it's worth trying to ensure you can proofread it. And then I've given you the starter model. Okay, this is on taking responsibility for the environment. It's not Greta Thunberg, our house is on fire, very dramatic, frightening stuff. This was more formulaic, and whilst there are statistics in there, which I looked up, and you've got sort of things like a thought-provoking tone and rhetorical questions, I think mine's a different style to hers. But by all means, feel free to go and look up different writers' ways of working. I've given the link to her speech here. So you're welcome to have a look at this too. But it's just a ways of giving you these practice papers. And I mean, for AQA, this would be paper 2, question 5, an exemplar. But before you even start, sign up and download all the freebies, because I've given some people some work questions like this with ideas to work through. And there's lots on the internet in the form of practice papers if you want to have a go at them too. I hope that helps.